won't matter because Florian doesn't show up on film anyway, so the vampire clan. Well, welcome back to another rocking PSE slash CD slash Sesame Cloakroom series. And this is, we're happy to have with us today Florian Kaiser. I won't go through much of the well-put bio about Florian. I can say that Florian and I first met when he came here to give a, actually he was here for a postdoc, mostly with Ellie Figuerel, but Mark Wilson and I sort of sequestered him for bits. And it turns out that Florian was interested in the environment. I had a few interests in that. And so over the years, he's pulled me even closer and closer toward things related to environmental cognition. Florian, back to Zurich, I think. I followed around where Florian goes. He goes to such interesting places I like to visit him. So I've seen him in Zurich, and then Trier, and Eindhoven, and now in Magdeburg. So you'll see the research he's been doing there. And even we met at Bad Hofgestein not too long ago in Austria at a very nice conference. And I must say that I was a little bit more reluctant for environmental cognition, and Florian made me aware of arenas of environmental psychology I wasn't aware of before, and to an EDRA conference, Environmental Design Research Association, and so forth. And so I've learned a lot from him. We've collaborated a few times, and it's always been interesting. And he knows lots of bits and pieces about the environment and his cognition that always mystified me and still does. We worked a little bit on I worked with him a little bit on his GEB scale, environmental behavior. There'll probably be a mention of that. But before I go on too long, let me just introduce Florian, and we'll hear what he says. You can see his talk today is the effective education for environmental competency and to advance more sustainable lifestyle. So I'll give you Florian Kaiser.
Thank you. I'm afraid in the meantime you have outperformed me with knowledge about climate change by far. So I have to make a humble contribution about social science aspects of climate change, I must say. So let me start, before I present you with an advanced organizer, I actually would like to talk with you about the goal of environmental education, at least the way I would portray it. So what we would like to ultimately attain, in my view, is that people lead a more sustainable life, kind of that they engage in more environmentally protective and to some extent what you could say is frugal behaviors of a certain type. So they should engage in more of these activities, and they should engage in them in a more frequent manner. So what we expect is that sustainable pro-environmental behavior should become actually more likely. And with it, of course, the resource consumption should go down. It doesn't help if you recycle paper and the bottom line is we consume more resources than we conserve, right? So bottom line is we need to become more engaged in pro-environmental activities, make them more frequently, but also this change in behavior should go along with actually energy consumption and resource consumption as well. So this is the ultimate goal of education. The expectation that people hold oftentimes is that more sustainably acting and deciding and thinking individuals need access to valid knowledge or information. If people only knew better, if people were told what science has to give, then we would already have attained much. Education in this kind of view would actually be reduced to the provision of the valid and accurate information and the transformation of this information into knowledge. Kind of Just that I think this is a kind of layperson view of the distinction between information. The information is out in books and knowledge is back in heads, right? So just to make the distinction, it doesn't really help having a book under your pillow. It needs actually to gradually filter into your head. So knowledge is, however, and this is my first argument, knowledge is not enough to advance sustainable performance, which is probably not a surprise to you. Environmental competency is like in sports or arts and science, a mixture between intellectual or physical ability and some motivation. So if we understand now that the intellectual ability we are talking about is actually environmental knowledge, then we already have a certain ingredient that is necessary for environmental competence. So we need to have sufficient environmental knowledge. But also, we need to have an additional motivation that makes us seeing value in consuming less. And one motivation that we propose, and what I want to introduce to you, is a concept that can be called appreciation for nature, or more in technical terms, an attitude toward nature. So, what is the critical benchmark? Of course, we want to attain more sustainably acting people, but what is the critical benchmark in such a education model, in a competence model? A more pronounced environmental attitude of individuals. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with attitude concepts. Are you? You are not. So the only thing that most people know about attitudes is attitudes are not related to behavior. So that's why I've actually added here some critical questions. Attitude? Really? Should we really be concerned about an attitude and not, there is a gap between what people say they do and how they act. So what I would like to do now is giving you in 4 parts our environmental competency model.
Just to be clear on what you're saying, you're not saying that attitude is unrelated to behavior. You're just saying that there's changing attitude does not imply changing behavior.
It is saying that when you go into the social psychology literature, people are very skeptical that even if you are successful in changing an attitude, that a subsequent behavior would follow that and there are chances that you find a 0 correlation between your measure for attitude and your behavior measure. So that's basically the classical concern about attitude. What I would like to argue in my first part of the presentation, and there are only 4 that you have to suffer through. So actually in my first part, I would like to give you some evidence that there is actually environmental attitude measurable, and it's a strong indication for sustainable lifestyles. So I actually want to justify why our criterion in our environmental competence model is actually environmental attitudes. Let me start with some measurement items you might be familiar with. So if you want to measure a math ability, how will you approach that? Let's say you are now a math teacher. Some of you might even be. So how do you want to grade your students? The ones that really are good in math and the ones that are not so good. Well, how do you do that? Would you present them with questions, tasks of the same kind? Like divisions all over again? Or what would you do? Sorry for being so mean and asking questions. Yes.
A test or a quiz.
A test. Yes, thank you. And what is the essence of a test?
Different questions to assess different levels of knowledge.
Different levels. The essence of a test is actually that you have not only questions of the same type, you actually try to modify the degree of difficulty of these kind of questions. So, and this should actually result in a very typical response pattern. So if a student is very talented, what would you expect? He can respond to the most difficult questions, but you would expect something else. Excuse me?
You should get the other ones right too.
Right. You would expect that not only the most difficult questions are solved by the most talented students, but also the second difficult and the easy ones. Right. And the other way around. If somebody fails, even with easy ones, you don't expect them to have correct answers with the difficult ones. So transitivity is a very powerful means to assess an ability of a scholar, of a student, of a pupil, and of people. And so what we have here is, and this is what was actually traditionally proposed by Louis Guttman, this is a Guttman scale. You test basically the ability of your persons by exposing them to more and more difficult tasks, and if you have a perfectly ordered structure, a perfect measure, you find this kind of diagonal data matrix. This is what transitivity basically means. What we can do is now take this measurement principle and apply it to environmental attitude measurement. So what we do is we ask people about different types of performances. Do you recycle paper? Do you find protecting the environment an important issue? Are you refraining from using a clothes dryer? Do you refrain from ordering pizzas? This is what is meant actually by no convenience food. Are you refraining from fabric softener? Are you refraining from owning a car? Are you an active environmentalist, and are you participating in a carpool? Again, what is the essence? These behaviors or behavioral reports are actually ordered from easy to difficult, and we can actually assess the environmental attitude by the extent a person engages in these behaviors or does not. Yes?
These are empirical findings? Because I would think that refraining from owning a car would be harder than participating in a carpool.
Surprisingly, it's not. No, these are more or less. You know, I'm also a little generous with the orders. If you want to see the precise numbers, no, the carpool is actually quite far up. It's because in Europe you don't have carpool lanes and not so bad traffic as
okay.
here. You know, kind of. So there is not much reward system.
So you find, I mean, so everybody who participates in a carpool does all of these other things as well, or
you know,
supposed to.
in a strict sense, that we do not find a Guttman scale. That's why we predict probabilities. And here is basically the answer to the question. We are not aiming to predict whether people actually do these behaviors, how likely are these behaviors, and so people are free to a certain extent to engage in these behaviors, but their response vector to our questions should actually reveal the extent of attitude following this logic of increasingly difficult tasks, because the task can be generalized across persons.
It's not just the case, though, that carpool is rare. It's the case that it's rare and somehow probabilistically contingent.
The question is, what makes it rare?
Yeah.
And the only assumption we make is that because there is some behavioral cost involved. And that's why it's rare. And we use basically the relative frequency as an approximation of the difficulty, and then we estimate the difficulty and see whether the transitivity order can be generalized about the person. So that's a Rush model test. It has a vector, right? So if you have any technical questions, please feel free to answer them. So what you see here is basically the relationship that we suggest between the responses that we get, the probability, so to speak, and this is explained by the overall attitude or environmental attitude, if you wish, of a particular person, n minus the relative difficulty of a behavior. So obviously we can say an environmental attitude is expressed and approachable by the behavioral costs a person is willing to ignore, right? Okay. That is just to understand how we measure attitude. To your information, this model is called the Campbell paradigm. It's quite new, 2010 we have published this Campbell paradigm, and so far it's not widely used, not to tell you the truth. I think there are our group and Jan's group are using it, but it's not that it's overly popular. Just that we don't get me wrong here. But what we can measure is that the higher the appreciation of environmental protection, the more of these behaviors people engage in. A very straightforward interpretation.
But just in case it was missed, in Ed's question in your response, since these were from Europe, you might find them somewhat different, like in Idaho versus Los Angeles and Manhattan.
What we have found is actually you should explore the order in your own country, because within countries this order works quite well. This order works actually quite well in Northern Europe. So in Germany, in Holland, in Switzerland, in Austria, there it works quite well. For the US, you will find, and we have a study in 2000 where we compared Northern and Southern Californians, you will see that Californians have a totally different order. Yes.
Does it take into account that some of these things might not be done for like environmental reasons, but for like financial?
Yes.
Like I refrain from owning a car because I cannot afford a car.
Yes, of course. There are multiple answers to your question. One is, for example, when we ask students to fill that in, we also make a statement, if there are boundary conditions that prevent you from even engaging in them, please that answer as not applicable. So if you don't own a car, you should not respond to whether you refrain from using a car. Yeah, right. And the other question is, if there are strong financial incentives, like on solar panel in Germany, then these financial incentives reduce the behavioral cost and make this particular behavior for a certain environment for all people easier. So it actually filters down in the relative difficulty in this particular behavior. That's why you have basically to control, is your cultural context sensitive to these kind of influences, and does the order change? So, but these are all technical questions. So what we did is now, if we came up with the idea of another environmental attitude measure, we've asked the question, is this really environmental attitude? How much overlap do we have with traditional such measures? And as you see, here is a correlation which is corrected for measurement error attenuation between our measure of environmental attitude and a very traditional one that contains items like ultimate survival depends on humankind living in harmony with nature, or smoking chimneys upset me because they imply pollution. And then you can have various levels of agreement with these kind of states. This is a traditional attitude scale. And what you can conclude here, we have quite a decent overlap with such scales as well. When you look at another attitude measure that is heavily used in environmental psychology, the new ecological or environmental paradigm, you see that the overlap is not so high. But part of the problem is, and here are examples of the NEP scale, humans are severely abusing the environment. Plants and animals have as much right as humans to exist. The problem here is that the NEP is notorious for being multidimensional. So, and that actually attenuates any relationship with a unidimensional scale. So we have here a problem with NEP. But this is, of course, is a question of, is the glass half full or is it half empty? You know, is this now a huge overlap? Which is the better scale? Should we use preservation? Should we use this preservation scale or should we use this scale? I think it's a matter of taste, right? So we proceed in our analysis and want to demonstrate that there is a relationship between our environmental attitude measure and people's particular ecological or pro-environmental behavior. The one behavior that we thought is particularly striking is vegetarian diets. So are people vegetarians or not? What we would expect is, and surprisingly, for a long time, I'm not sure whether you guys know that so well, but for a long time people were not so aware that vegetarianism is one of the strongest things to do if you really want to do something for the environment. And it was not obvious, you know, for many when we did this study. So we had the hypothesis that if somebody is really concerned about the environment, he or she should engage in a vegetarian lifestyle. And what we found is actually that when we use our measure of environmental attitude, we find this differentiation between non-vegetarians and vegetarians. And even stronger, we find a linear trend, even if when we actually reorder our vegetarians post hoc in the ones that are basic vegetarians, they only reduce eating meat, and then we use the more advanced vegetarians, the ones that actually do not eat meat and refrain from eating honey or wearing leather shoes. These are the advanced vegetarians. And then you have the extreme vegetarians, that's the ones that actually reduce eating meat, they don't eat honey, and they don't wear leather shoes. So they are basically, that's the kind of continuum we are built in, and as you can see, even with this very crude assumptions, we find a significant linear trend. So obviously, these kind of vegetarian lifestyle seems to be sensitive to people's environmental attitude. By contrast, when we use our NEP scale, we don't even find a differentiation between vegetarians and non-vegetarians. So we have believed that our attitude measure is actually superior to what is the standard in environmental attitude measurement. But that's not all. When we actually use our environmental attitude scale and we map it against the annual electrical power consumption of households, we find a negative linear trend, which is not huge, admittedly. What it says is, with increasing attitudes, the electricity consumption of a household goes down. That's exactly the link that we see between lifestyle and environmental attitude. So if we could improve attitudes, we would actually predict that we could also reduce their energy consumption in households. Why is the correlation so low? Because the annual electricity consumption is quite a messy data set. So you should not expect here extremely accurate assessments of electricity consumption. And it's actually a surprise that we even found this relationship. The interesting part here is that we had 24. The whole data set is relatively large. So we have 893 persons, but these 893 persons can be differentiated in regular customers and 24 pioneers. These 24 subjects were enrolled in a green electricity. You have green electricity here as well, I assume, right? Renewable electricity contracts. And in the first generation, customers had to pay more for green energy than in later generations. Nowadays, it's basically the same costs. But in the first generation, these 24 energy customers of the energy provider we explored, they were willing to pay more for their electricity consumption. And if we compare now the electricity consumption of these two groups, what you realize is that there is 1/3 reduction in the average energy consumption. So these 24 peoples, they are on the lower end of environmental attitude, and it can have a quite substantial reduction in energy consumption, which is truly 1/3 of the electricity consumption, 1,200 kilowatt less than what the average does, even with messy data. So we are quite confident that our attitude measure is indeed a measure of people's lifestyle. Now, part 2. Now, I was just talking about attitude toward environmental protection, or environmental attitude, how it is called traditionally. But we should actually separate two different attitudes that are about the environment. And they are often confused. We should separate environmental attitude and attitude toward nature. Let me start with a quote from Frederick Law Olmsted. He was a co-designer of New York's Central Park. The occasional contemplation of natural scenes, particularly if this contemplation occurs in connection with relief from ordinary cares, is favorable to the health and vigor of people. So going out into nature and have some great experiences there is good for you. Right. And this idea is actually all over in environmental psychology and has found some interest in recent years, was reinvigorated, so to speak. And so some of my colleagues came up with fancy new concepts like environmental identity, inclusion of nature in oneself, connectedness to nature, or nature relatedness. And of course, they have a beautiful story why they label their concepts in that particular manner. And all of them have developed their own scale and measurement instrument, as it should be in science, right? Yes. So, and we were again the nasty people. We said, we don't believe that these things are really separate and different. So what we did is this one study in European psychologists saying, although these measures look very different on a superficial level, if you just compare them technically with factor analysis, you will find that they are reflecting one single factor. And that's what they did. And we took the liberty and added one more of such scales, which was also measuring the same thing. And so what we believe that these measures all reflect is attitude towards nature. Whether people appreciate nature, commune with nature, go out there, enjoy nature experiences. And so with a little side study, we have explored whether ease of access to nature, simply because you have a forest in your backyard, doesn't help you. You have to go there. Yes. And it's of course correlated that you go there. If you have easier access, the chances are you go there. But ease of access doesn't help you to make gratifying experiences. No, you have to go there to make gratifying experiences, and if you make gratifying experiences, you can expect that your attitude towards nature increases. Great. This was trivial because that's what basically an attitude is. You have to make gratifying experiences, and then your appreciation increases, right? So what we had to do as a next step is we had to measure, and this is what I already introduced to you, also attitude toward nature. So a couple of items we suggested in our first version is statements like pets are part of the family. Many people would agree on that. And some are spending time in nature. Some even enjoy gardening. Some talk to animals. Even if it's raining, they go for walks. Some collect mushrooms and berries. And even the weird ones, they mimic animal behavior. And you see them in zoos sometimes. Mimic the walk of a vulture, for example. So again, we measure this kind of attitude, but as you notice, the items look very different from environmental attitude, right? So our question was, is this now one uniform attitude, or are these items, the 50 environmental protective items and this nature appreciation items, do they reflect two different dimensions? And what we found is they are indeed different dimensions, but they are highly correlated. So we have a 0.5 correlation. So people who appreciate nature will also do something to protect the environment. Not so surprising, right? Okay. But this was our starting point. So obviously we can differentiate between these two types of attitudes, and maybe there is something to gain by knowing this differentiation. The interesting part is, and this is a cross-leg panel design. Do you know what a cross-leg panel design is? It's a simple approach from statistics with structural equation modeling. What you do is you basically predict one attitude across time and the other attitude across time. And why is it called cross-leg? Because you want to see whether there is a crossing influence from one to the other. Just to explore, getting a first indication whether there is a causal relationship between the two. So we were actually quite surprised, because you don't see very frequently in statistics and in psychology, I must say, relationship with beta weights of 0.99. So the proportion of explained variance was basically 100%. We didn't trick, I promise, we didn't fake these data. They are really gathered. What we see here is, again, the correlation that we have previously found, 0.53 instead of 0.51. Yeah, it's close enough, right, to say that's the same. So obviously environmental attitude and attitude toward nature, they correlate highly. But then even in a time lag of 2 years, you see no change. Environmental attitude predicts environmental attitude perfectly. Nature attitude predicts nature attitude perfectly. Even if you compare mean values, the mean value remained invariant. Nothing happens, no spontaneous change. The ones that are high in attitude at some time will remain high at the other time as well. So this was quite surprising, and the correlation remains stable.
So, I mean, they have very stable attitudes, which, if
Yes.
you know a little bit about social psych literature, that's really rare. But maybe, I mean, they are adults, right? So,
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people here work with kids, so maybe by the time they're 30 years old, their attitudes are already
Yes.
formed, right?
That's a good point. I have another research going on with Cornell, and what we think is about the turning point is 18.
Okay.
When it becomes relatively stable where they are heading to. So, but before that, I would certainly see the point that the
Otherwise,
attitudes
just I'll give
are
up.
quite some flexibility. Yes. Good. But what is the important part here? The important message is, when we don't do anything, there is no change. So we have to have measures of intervention. We need to have a leverage, otherwise attitudes remain stable. And then probably the question is, what kind of leverages do we have? So environmental knowledge has some relevance for environmental attitude. That is now the third part that I would like to give you some evidence. Can you read from the back there? Okay. So this is about a representative study again with adults, but this time it's truly a representative study. We had a response rate of about 55% and 2,700 persons that we have exposed to an environmental knowledge test. And the interesting elements here is that we've started to differentiate among different types of environmental knowledge. The first type is system knowledge. So for instance, this is about what are the mechanistic relationship. How do specific environmental systems work? How long does it take to grow 10 centimeters of soil in Switzerland? Or a question that is on Michael's mind, what are the mechanistic processes behind climate change? This is the what question. You know, what are the components and the relationship within a system? So that's what we call environmental systems knowledge. If you possess this kind of knowledge, then you wouldn't know already what to do. So there is something else. If you know that CO2 is relevant, the question will come, what kind of action can I take? What can I do to reduce my personal CO2 emissions or to conserve certain resources? So, and then a typical question is, by becoming a vegetarian or at least by reducing my meat in my diet, would that work? That would be then a typical item here. And even if I knew what I can do, there are so many things I could do. What would be, so to speak, the most effective measure to take? Effectiveness knowledge is the third kind of information that I need. How can one best reduce one's CO2 emission? What is most effective? How can resources be conserved most effectively? Comparing aircraft with trains, how much more energy do I need per capita per kilometer? I would assume most of you wouldn't know. I don't know either. You know, I'm not saying that we have a lot of this kind of knowledge, but you see, people's time is reduced. And even if they are highly motivated, they have to ask the question, what should I do best to attain something? Otherwise they are overwhelmed. And what we found in this study is we can actually, as anticipated, these types of knowledge in a very systematic way. So we need to have systems knowledge to ask these kind of related questions, and we need to have action knowledge to ask the effectiveness knowledge question. And when we have action knowledge and when we have effectiveness knowledge, it will result in more environmental attitude. Quite disappointing, isn't it? 6%. What is the explanation of this disappointing result? What do you think? Any suggestions? Obviously, knowledge has consequences for attitude. That's the good news. That's what we expected. But why is it so disappointingly low? No, the answer is very simple. When you have no variance, there is no covariance. If there are no differences in knowledge and people do know nothing, you cannot expect a correlation. Right? What I'm saying is, our Swiss population knew so little that we couldn't discriminate among them. And so their attitude differences could not be reflected in their knowledge because there was none. If we repeat the same study with ETH students, you know, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, the one prime institute in Switzerland that thinks that's almost as good as MIT, probably they even think they are better. These students we have used as our subjects, and at that time I worked there in a department of environmental sciences. So what I've done is I have sampled electrical engineering students, forestry students, and environmental science students. What you see here is the mean value in terms of environmental knowledge, but also in terms of environmental attitude. And why are these rectangles of different sizes? Because we had different numbers of subjects in all of these boxes that reflect simply the confidence interval of these estimates. What you see, electrical engineers don't know much about environmental things. Forestry students, even in the first year, know a little more. What a surprise. And environmental science students, since this is their particular subject, know a bit more than forestry students. So if the rectangles don't overlap, then it's actually a significant difference. So what you can say is environmental science students know significantly more than forestry students, but they do not act, or they are not more environmentally concerned, at least not in a statistically significant sense. That's the total non-overlapping in regard of this dimension. But the fortunate thing that you see here is at least the environmental science lecturer know more than their students. Quite significantly more so. Why is that so big? Because we had only 44 lecturers in our center, right? But as you see, as well as in terms of environmental knowledge, as well as in terms of environmental attitude, they did more for the environment, they acted more according to their knowledge. And what happens? We can actually find now a correlation of 0.43, which translates in almost 20% explained variance in environmental attitude. We are speaking of a change in a factor of 3. So the very moment we have individual differences in knowledge, we find this covariance between knowledge and environmental attitude or performance. Another thing that happens, with increasing knowledge, the three-dimensional structure of knowledge collapses. It becomes more consistent, coherent. We don't have to differentiate the three types of knowledge. They scale on one single dimension. So that's another result that we had with this study. I'm afraid that's the only paper I cannot recommend you to read, because that's the only paper I have in German, or you are fluent in German, then I'm happy to send you the paper as well. So, now, another question that might be relevant in connection with environmental education and knowledge is, can we now really affect environmental attitude? And what you see here is a study that was conducted in 2001, consisting of nearly 800 persons, and a study 2010 with more than 2,000 participants. What we tried to find out is, although we had this kind of very disappointing earlier result that attitudes wouldn't change without input over time, we thought that cannot be the last word to it. There must be a change in environmental attitudes, at least occasionally. So what we did is we compared our two cohorts, the one of 2001 and 2010, with each other. What we typically find in connection with self-reports of behavior, and our attitude measure is a self-report of pro-environmental or environmental protective behavior. With self-reports, what we find typically is an age effect. When people grow older, they do more for the environment, sadly to say. But as you see, this trend hasn't really changed 10 years later. What we notice is that the younger people have gained a little bit. That's why the slope is not as steep as before. So the age effect is not as dramatic as it used to be. So obviously this group was sensitive to something. You asked the question, is there hope for change? That's why I pointed to it. So obviously these youngsters were sensitive to something, that the age effect is now less pronounced. Could it be that in certain historical changes, that certain historical stages could have influenced these people because they were born before the war? In Germany, this is still an issue, right? So people are more frugal, that's the idea, or maybe more consumptive because they have to had so many harsh times that they want to consume now more and enjoy their lives, right? But there was no historic period effect, as you see here. When you are born after the 1970s, or when you are born before the 40s, before the war, you see basically the same trend, whether it's measured in 2001 or in 2010. So there is no historical period that made environmental attitude more pronounced. What you see is, however, there is a zeitgeist effect between 2010 and 2001. What does that mean? Obviously, on average, people got more environmentally concerned, irrespective of their age and when they were born. Obviously, something has happened between 2000 and 2020, and we suggest climate change has happened. Yes?
Are you saying that there's no effect of historic period? Because I mean, those are definitely slopes, but you're saying that I mean, it looks like they're headed in the direction of significance, if not significant.
Yes, but this is a reflection of the age effect. With increasing age, basically, you find
yeah, so there is an age. I mean, there's definitely people
yes,
more.
of course.
Yeah,
But it's
okay.
not the historical period. It's not because they were actually suffering through or before the war that this could be attributed, has resulted in this slope, because the slopes are perfectly parallel. So it's the historical period you're born into didn't change or add anything to it. Otherwise, there would be a change in the slope. What we find is, however, that in this decade in between, the numbers of reports about climate change basically exploded in German newspapers. And so what we assume is that information truly matters. We haven't tested that in a causal way. We just took this as circumstantial evidence to understand what could have happened. So obviously, our interpretation would be maybe information matters to people. Maybe if it's not education in a strict sense, maybe it's propaganda, right? Could be. It's simply that people were exposed now with information about a new subject that is truly related with their environmental concern. Yes?
So you have attitude on the scale. I think you may have said that they acted, but this is the attitude, not the behaviors.
This is the self-report behavior measure. You know, our environmental attitude, or the GEB as we refer, is a self-report behavior measure which we say is measuring environmental attitude.
Right.
So,
yeah. So one of the, I think you mentioned before that one of the reasons that it tends to go up with age is that when you're older, you have more opportunities to recycle or something like that. You own your own.
we don't have more. No, that can be excluded. There are not more. The relative difficulty of all the behaviors remains invariant.
Regardless of your age?
Yes.
Like even if you
That's
can't afford a car? Or?
That's a basic assumption. It's just excluded. This data point is
I
ignored,
gotcha,
so
I
to
see.
speak.
So the question I had was, in the United States, I think more studies than not have suggested that the older you are, the lower your environmental attitude.
Yes.
And I mean, we found in our studies that when you partial out things like conservatism and party membership, that often goes away.
Yes.
But it's certainly the case that as a default, the older you are in the United States, it seems like you're
Yes.
less environmental. Do you think that's just a country versus country difference?
No, that has nothing to do with county. That has something to do with the measures of attitudes that are normally used, which are, on average, relatively. I can not really be polite. I'm sorry to say that. They are useless because they are more or less single item measures asking about whether it's important to do something for the environment where climate change exists or not. You know, you have one data point and you want to discriminate among so many people. How much reliability do you expect with such a crappy measure? And you know, the answer to your point is, as long as I don't see a really sensible, useful environmental attitude measure that is reflecting, and I'm not saying you have to use behavioral self-report. You can actually replicate our scale with very traditional attitude items as well. As long as we scale them, as long as we are aware of certain measurement issues that need to be considered, as long as we scale them as a rush scale, it works fine. You don't have to use self-report. My point is, what most colleagues actually fail to do is using the rush model as measurement models for attitude. That would be the politest answer I can give. Yes, please. Yes.
Sorry. So I guess it seems like you're getting rid of that like youngest group there by just combining them with the next data points up, and then the slope goes away, right? Because your 1970 data point on your right graph includes both the under 30 and the 33-39. I guess I'm wondering is, would you still get parallel slopes on the right one if you used a 1980 as your leftmost data point? Because that will look more like what you've got on your...
You know, the only reason why this should be fairly equivalent. The only reason is that we have left out some persons is because then in the equal category we would have so few data points that actually confidence intervals became useless. So I don't expect that we really have a fundamental difference here. But I'm happy to send you the paper that if you find the flaw, let me know. Yes.
So I'm still a little confused about what this is showing, because I thought in several slides previous to this, you were saying that with no intervention,
Yes.
Attitudes won't change.
Yes.
And so, but this to me is saying that just time, by living older, that your attitude does change. Is that what this is saying?
That's a good point. You're right. Obviously, time takes a toll. People become different over time, and we have used 2 years, right? That might not have been enough for spontaneous change. That's one interpretation. I think you are on the right spot, but there is another one. Even if you take a decade in which something relevant happens in terms of information, that could actually contribute for a change as well. What I'm saying is, there is an intervention, a real life intervention you hadn't controlled. That's one influence of change. And another one is what you just pointed out. If we look long enough and hard enough, people get more and more environmentally concerned over their age. Yes, there is hope. You know, I think you're right. That is a contradiction to this stability over 2 years. In the short run, we don't find much attitude change, but there is hope. There is possibility for change. Right. Let me get to my last part. I hope you are still having 5 minutes. Okay? Let me present you now you have all the pieces. Now I would like to present you with environmental competence. I will skip that one because these are the 2 environmental competence models that you find in the literature. They are insofar very different because they refer to very unspecific intellectual abilities, and you wonder what is their relationship to environmental concern or pro-environmental behavior, because whether you are able to self-reflection is probably something that is quite useful for your social affairs as well, and not only for environmental protection, right? And if you compile everything together into one single dimension, then you have a single intellectual ability that seems to reflect everything. So these are just more intellectual reasons, not so convincing models of competency. So I'm wasting a little time on them as well, just to explain you why we came up with a model that looks now a little bit different. What we have here is, and what you might have realized from my earlier presentation, we have intellectual abilities, knowledge, environment-related knowledge that might be important. But we have something else. We have a motivational ability that might be important, which we call attitude toward nature or appreciation for nature. And the nice part here is that the influence is again 0.5 of environmental attitude. You see we have 3 different statistical models, and the conclusion, and we have 3 different samples. These are now definitely students, 13.7 years in age. So we have extremely different samples. We always find the same 0.5 correlation. Environmental attitude seems to have an impact on nature attitude seems to have an impact on environmental attitude. So the interesting aspect is, what we expect is that there are 2 things that we should try to change with environmental education: the appreciation for nature and knowledge about the environment. There are 2 knowledge effects, as you might have noticed. One knowledge effect is, of course, between knowledge and environmental attitude, which is not very strong but explainable because there is not much available right now. And there are not many curricula that actually carry environmental knowledge as part of it. But there is another one. Yes, the second environmental knowledge effect is convergence. The more knowledge people have, the more the knowledge converges. So there are 2 components, but there are also 2 motivational effects. And the one motivational effect that I see relevant is the nature, the appreciation for nature has an impact on people's knowledge. And I think that's what I really like about Michael's proposal as well, that the numbers that create some surprise create motivation to search for more knowledge. That's exactly the same relationship that we expect here. Either it's the appreciation or you're surprised that you didn't know. And of course, this is one aspect, but there is a second one. And I'm afraid that's the one aspect that I don't think the numbers hold. That is a direct influence on pro-environmental engagement. If I realize that I lack knowledge, it's not the same. That makes me maybe search for knowledge, and then this knowledge might trigger environmental protection indirectly, but there is no direct influence, and that's the second motivational influence. Appreciation for nature makes you protect the environment and act more sustainably. So, let me come to my last slide. If our political goal truly is we should create more sustainable lifestyles, I think that requires more sustainably thinking and acting individuals. And we need a considerably more environmentally concerned population. What does that involve? We have to have higher aspirations. Every single one of us needs to have much higher aspirations. And unfortunately, it's not fun. It's actually more self-sufficiency, less comfort, less amenities, less consumption. All the things you don't want to hear. Right. And here your aspirations should be. And that's the message nobody really tells you and sells you. Buy this gadget and it's so easy to become an environmentalist. Do this and consume more and you get there. No, there is no way. You need to have environmental goals that are demanding, and that means sacrifice. Sorry, I'm not better than the Pope. You have to sacrifice. So significantly advancement of environmental attitude is that we have, first of all, overcome a massive lack of knowledge. Here I'm fully with Michael and his message as well, with Ed, of course. But we need also formation of appreciation of nature. Maybe that's something we should really reconsider. We need more gratifying learning experiences in and around nature. Something that we have abandoned a little bit in environmental education. In short, we need a strategic formation of environmental competency by ways of environmental education, and we have to actually promote knowledge and motivation. So here is a list of my contributors of this research. There are a couple more, but then you couldn't read the names in the back, so I thought I'd leave that here. So thank you very much. No questions? Yes, please.
I was wondering about something you started your talk with. So the test, how did you come up with what were the items? So as I remember the table, there's the car use, there's the fabric softener. So how does one make it to that list?
I think the short answer is I stole them.
Okay.
There was in 1908, actually when I came here in 94, I had a little list of 38 items that came from a diploma thesis of an environmental economist in southern Germany. Never met her, but it was public good, and I asked whether I could use the items. And so I started with these 38 items, 8 of which were basically pro-social behavior and had nothing to do with the environment, so I had a list of 30 items. And then after some time here, people complained about my stupid questions, and these are not really environmental behaviors, you have to revise them. So I think Michael gave me 100, and so I had after Berkeley I had 65 of them. And so I did another study and explored these 65. And then I went back to Switzerland and then some industrial, environmental, what is it called?
IO, industrial organization.
No, it's industrial ecology, where they do the life cycle assessment stuff. In environmental science, they looked at these items and said, gee, they are horrible. You know, kind of. So I had them to have a look at these items, and so we screened them according to environmental impact and whether they are relevant in comparison to most other sensible kind of behavior. So we came up with a set of quite reliable at that time 50 of these self-reported behaviors, which we published as our framework. And most of these 50 are actually used in these various studies. And in 2012, some of my students came, hey, these behaviors are a little outdated, maybe we should update. So now we have actually revised a little bit and added to this 50 items some. So it's a constant change. But the problem is actually not so, it sounds a little more dramatic than it is, because that's the nice feature about rush models. As long as you keep some of them in them, your estimation of an attitude is measurement instrument independent, free. So you can generalize your message across all items that are within a rush homogeneous pool. So we can add for different cultures and societies new items if necessary. So this is, but these are technical features which I'm happy to share with you when you are more interested about rush models. Yes.
Also, I should mention, Florian's been here since October, and he'll be here through the end of February?
Not about 4 more weeks.
4 more weeks. So one question I had, and maybe, I like this Pope like better than maybe every other Pope. I still think that there may be a more optimistic spin you can take on the sacrifice, because it's sort of, I think implicitly there may be like a business as usual kind of notion that with the same kinds of technologies we have here and so forth, but let's say that, like there was a radio show today about getting energy from the ocean currents,
Yes.
tidal currents and things like that. So, let's say that you could put together a package of things that like that wouldn't kill birds, and you wouldn't have to use as much maybe solar panels. It's not relying on the sun or the wind and so forth. So I could imagine one possibility that we wouldn't have to sacrifice quite so much if we could find sustainable ways. In fact, one analysis I've seen suggested that we have about the Earth spends 10 times as much as it on fossil fuel subsidies as it would be to just convert the whole planet to solar power.
Yeah.
So if we had the political will and we actually changed, our power, then we wouldn't have to sacrifice very much, because we have this wonderful wave power, and we could, bring plastics back and make other things from them and so forth. So it's kind of like a business as usual. We're going to have to sacrifice, or we'll have to have our governments make us sacrifice, right?
Yes, but I'm afraid my message is a little more bleak, and I haven't presented data for that, but I'm happy to share an article that we have written about energy consumption per capita in different societies. And what you notice that even the countries with the most stringent energy efficient policies have actually never really gone down. So the per capita energy consumption of no society has ever decreased, except for one. Can you guess which one? The US. And do you know what the reason is? After 2008, the wealth has disappeared. You are not as wealthy as you used to be. I'm afraid that's, it's a horrible message I'm aware of, and I'm stretching my expertise. I'm not an economist, but the result that I conclude from it is, it seems to be that the wealth of a society is a predicament that creates us to reinvest all gains we have in other consumption. And that's our interpretation. People actually, more efficient technology leads to saving some money. And the question is, what do we do with this money savings? We reinvest it in other consumption, which actually needs energy to be produced. And so there is never anything happening in terms of reduction when there is no loss in wealth. And I think this is a really scary message. No politician will love that. And I think it's really scary to keep that in mind, but that makes just clear how difficult it is what we try to achieve.
Maybe I'm very naive on this, but by what measure has the United States decreased in wealth? I know there's a greater disparity between the poorest and the richest, but as a society as a whole, our GDP has been increasing.
Yes, but the GDP is probably increasing, but the energy consumption in this regard, I'm not saying we have here clear evidence. What I'm noticing after coming here, and I do admit this is only very personal evidence, your consumption power per dollar has decreased quite dramatically. You do not get as much as you got 10 years back for your dollar. I'm not saying, I think this needs a thorough economic analysis.
Yeah.
What we have right now is just this one indication.
There's more air in our cereal.
Yes. There is more air in your cereal, you could say that.
I want to have others have the chance, but just to push the positive, optimistic thing again.
Yes.
I think we can still have a society that slightly increases its energy use if we can really increase our sustainable, right? So like, let's say that by miraculously, our wave power or other thing or solar could quadruple our energy.
Yes.
it's conceivable that we could stay ahead of the curve of damaging the planet. It still seems to me like it's a parametric question.
I'm afraid only when you look at your nation. At the very moment you make a window of global dimensionality open, then you will realize how should we attain 14 kilowatt per person every second. You know, the US needs 14 kilowatt, and how should we attain 2 kilowatts for every person on the planet? You know, the discrepancy is that you guys use 12 kilowatt more than you are allowed to use if we share energy fairly in the world. And so even if you come down to 13 kilowatt right now, you are still 11 kilowatt short of your 2 kilowatt goal, if you think about this in a more strategic and global view. And honestly, I thought I had a positive and optimistic message. I think intrinsic motivation to do something to protect the environment is a positive message. It can be changed. Environmental education plays an important role, but we should also not trick ourselves to say this will be the Big Bang. The Big Bang is an enormous task which is hard to attain and which is politically definitely not a message people want to hear. You know, I think that one thing is being positive, and I'm fully with you. On the other hand, we should also not play stupid. Sorry, that was a bad last word. So I'm sorry. I think we should now close, I guess, otherwise.
Yeah, people got to welcome come up and chat with Florian, but Ralph, thanks very much.
If anybody has an interest, fgk@berkeley.edu when you want to have access to some of the things.